ha tenido a su cargo una serie de proyectos relacionados con investigación que ha hecho para el gobierno de Escocia y también para si lo voy a decir en inglés, el National College for School Leadership, que es una asociación, es una especie de escuela formadora en educación, publicada por la editorial CIIE. Es un gran honor para nosotros, yo creo, tener acá al profesor Menter y los dejo ahí. Lo invito a que nos haga su presentación de hoy día sobre el tema de educación, formación de profesores en Inglaterra y en general desde una perspectiva más amplia.
Thank you, Beatrice. It's a great honor and a privilege to be invited to speak at this very amazing conference. Thank you to the organising committee, and thanks especially to Beatrice Avalos for inviting me and for looking after me so well. I want to start with one apology and one promise. The apology is that I'm not going to speak in Spanish. I have 3 children, and 2 of them are fluent Spanish speakers, and it's my shame that I cannot talk to them in Spanish but only in English, and similarly my shame today. But in passing, I'd like to thank the translators who've been working so hard over the past couple of days. I've been listening to them avidly through my earpiece. That was the apology. The promise, for those of you who saw my compatriot Professor Hargreaves yesterday, the promise is I will not be doing any press-ups during this presentation, nor will I be doing any impressions, especially of Tony Blair. I'll leave that to the experts. It's very exciting to be here. It's my first visit to Chile, and I must congratulate the organisers on bringing so many educational researchers together. I think it's very exciting how many young people there are here and how many teachers from schools there are here. If we had the same kind of profile at some of our conferences for educational research in the UK, I think we would be much more optimistic about the future than we currently are. I think you can be very optimistic about your future, such is the vibrancy of the community here over these 2 days. I got very excited when I was invited to come to this beautiful country and started reading about it and looking forward to learning a great deal, which I have been doing. Since being invited and seeing how beautiful the mountains are as I flew over them only a few hours ago, 36 hours ago, since I was invited, I came across a colleague, a student, working in our Department of Education at the University of Oxford, Lorena Ortega, who is, some of you may know her. She recently presented an early seminar on the research that she's doing at Oxford on teacher effectiveness in Chile. And she also kindly gave me a number of papers, several of them actually written by Beatrice, about education in Chile. Furthermore, coincidence would have it that I was lucky enough to meet the head of the Chilean athletics team, who was over in Oxford prior to the London Olympics. This is him on the left, and here he is somewhere in today's audience. It's very great to welcome Alvaro Gonzalez today as well. Thank you for coming, Alvaro. And just last week in a cinema, a small cinema in Oxford, I saw a very moving documentary film set in the Atacama Desert, in English called Nostalgia for the Light, directed by Patricio Guzman, which both portrayed the search for the meaning of life through astronomy, but also the search for the meaning of life and death through the recent history of Chile. A very moving film, which I don't think has actually been shown in Chile yet, from what I've gathered. But when it is, I think you will find it interesting. And it's a history, of course, that many of you know and have lived through. What I hope to cover in this talk is not so much about the meaning of life, but trying to be a bit less ambitious and deal a bit with the meaning of teacher education. I'm going to start by offering 3 personal premises about teacher education, then talk about developments currently in Scotland, where I was working until very recently, and I think there is a kind of crossroads in Scotland as well. Thirdly, to talk about the literature review on teacher education in the 21st century that I led while I was working in Scotland, for what it tells us about the current state of teacher education and research on teacher education, and really use that to look at the relationship between policy, practice and research in teacher education in Scotland. In brief, I will contrast that with the same relationships in England, such as they exist. And of course, a crossroad's an interesting metaphor. When you get to a crossroad, you have at least 3 choices. You can go straight on the way you're going, you can go left, you can go right, or you can stop and go nowhere, or you can turn around and go back where you came from. And I'm afraid that in England we have possibly come to a bit of a dead end and maybe being forced backwards a bit, but we'll get to that later. And then I'll offer some conclusions, and all of that within 40 minutes. So I better get going. I said I want to offer 3 premises, 3 kind of ways of understanding teacher education. And the first of them is this, which is why I'm so interested in teacher education. By their teacher education ye shall know them. It's worth noting at the outset that teacher education is mostly organized at the level of the state, sometimes the nation state, and sometimes a state in a federation of states. This no doubt reflects the fact that schooling systems are mostly organized at that level as well, and it's usually assumed that teachers should be educated for the particular system within which they are intending to work. At a time of increasing globalization in our economy, or economies, and as we've been hearing over the last 2 days, increasing privatization in education, it is deeply fascinating that education and teacher education continue to be mainly organized at national and/or state level. Although that's not, of course, to deny the significant influence of global forces within those national systems, and we heard about some of that yesterday. So my point is that through reviewing and analysing a nation's teacher education system, we're appraising what it is that teachers should know, should be able to do, and how they should be disposed in order to help the formation of the future adult citizens of that society in perhaps 10 or 20 years' time. Teacher education may be taken to be highly symbolic of how a society sees its future. Vision was the word that Andy used yesterday. And teacher education is indicative, I suggest, of the underlying values of a society. Perhaps it is a realization of this that has turned teacher education into such a center of political interest in the past 20 to 30 years in many countries. My second premise is really the other side of the same coin as the first one. We come to understand the nature of any teacher education system through examining the history, culture, and politics of that system and of that society. This, if you like, is the methodological underpinning of my approach that I'm taking in this talk. The importance of the relationship between history, culture, and politics within a given system, a given society. The third premise which is what this talk is really all about, is that the relationship between research, policy and practice in teacher education is far from straightforward. It is complex. It's dynamic, but it's a very important aspect of what we are all interested in, whether we be researchers, policymakers, or practitioners, or a combination of any or all three of those. Later on, I'll be offering some examples of some of the complexity of these relationships and some of the tensions that exist. So, to turn towards Scotland now, this is the so-called United Kingdom, which curiously is not actually united, it's divided into 4 states. And I worked for 11 years recently in the northern state of Scotland before returning to my homeland, England. Moving to Scotland from England 12 years ago or so, I became very interested in carrying out comparative research between the 4 parts of the United Kingdom. And it is true that since about 2000, education policy in all 4 parts has increasingly diverged because there was a political devolution in 1999-2000. However, in Scotland, education policy had always carved quite a different path from that set in Westminster for the other 3 parts of the United Kingdom, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland has a population of about 5.5 million. In other words, it's about the third the size of Chile. It has mountains too, I'm pleased to say. They are also beautiful. This is Glencoe, but they're not quite so high or indeed quite so extensive as the Andes. Initial teacher education in Scotland has a very simple structure. Since late in the 20th century, it has been provided by just 7 university departments of education. And there's the list of the 7 universities in Scotland that provide initial teacher education. They all train teachers for primary and secondary schools, and the training is led from faculties or departments or schools of education within those universities. There are 1-year courses for primary and secondary teachers and 4-year courses as well for primary teachers and a few of the secondary teachers. However, as I indicated earlier, teacher education in Scotland is going through a process of significant change at present. About 3 years ago, the outgoing, retiring Senior Chief Inspector of Education, Graham Donaldson, was asked by the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary for Education, to undertake a review of teacher education in Scotland. The main trigger for this appears to have been some real friction in the system around the numbers of people entering training for teaching, and an apparent oversupply of teachers in many parts of Scotland. There were increasing numbers of unemployed teachers in Scotland. However, the review became much more than a study of supply and demand, became much wider than that. It was taken as an opportunity to review the whole of the system, as you can see from the terms of reference that were agreed, and here they are, to consider the best arrangements for the full continuum, meaning from pre-service right through into the late stages of a teacher's career, and to consider ITE, initial teacher education, induction, the very first stage, professional development, and the interaction between them. The review undertaken was actually the 3rd review of teacher education in Scotland in this century. There'd been reviews in 2001 and 2005, and they'd been interesting, but they'd led to very little real change. The review undertaken by Donaldson in 2010 was not only wide-ranging, it was organised in a very open and participatory way. Indeed, there was a commitment to gathering and using evidence to inform the review. That included, but not only, was based on research evidence. Many stakeholders, including organisations and individual teachers, were able to participate by offering their thoughts, by completing a questionnaire, or by taking part in discussion meetings. But Donaldson also commissioned a review of literature, which is what I want to focus on just now, because it gives us further insights into teacher education research, and also it can contribute to my ensuing discussion about the relationships between research, policy, and practice in teacher education. The literature review was undertaken by a large team of us in the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. We were given an aim, which is to understand the contribution that teacher education can make to the quality and effectiveness of the educational experience and wider personal development of young people, drawing on effective practice in Scotland and elsewhere. And if you want to jot down that web address, you can actually download the report that emerged. We actually started the search for literature by scanning a range of databases, identified more than 2,709 of which we actually scanned, and 290 of which we actually included in the review because they seemed relevant to the aims and objectives. This is, I'm afraid, very dense, but just to give you a feel of what the objectives of the literature review were: one, to provide a high-level overview of the current model of teacher education in Scotland. And note the singular current model. It's assumed there's just one model of teacher education in Scotland, which to a large extent is true. Secondly, to identify other education systems that have undergone significant curricular change, seen a rise in standards or are high-performing, and explore what contribution teacher education has made in those settings. To explore the relationships between forms of teacher education and the enhancement of professionalism, and between enhanced professionalism and pupil outcomes. And if you were listening to Andy Hargreaves yesterday, you'll begin to get a feel of how ambitious these tasks, these objectives are. Because it's basically saying cover everything that concerns teacher education and good teacher education anywhere that it moves in the world. And finally, to provide an overview of effective practice in evaluating impact and effectiveness of teacher education. Now, the report, I have it over there, is about 100 pages long, and I cannot do justice to the detail that we have drawn together in that report. So I am going to provide the shortest possible summary of our findings, or a summary of our findings in relation to each of those 4 objectives. But the main message will be that the real interest lies in the detail. There are no simple, quick fixes in relation to any of these objectives. That's the report when published. So the first objective, to provide a high-level overview of what was happening in Scotland, was relatively straightforward. And Scotland does have a good history of teacher education, a history of strong practice, of successful preparation of teachers, and many aspects of the ongoing support of teachers. But the major area of weakness we found from reading the literature was in relation to the links between the different partners in teacher education. And we suggested, consequently, that there should be a significant focus on developing the partnership between the various stakeholders. On the second objective, we suggested, again, politicians don't like to hear this kind of complex answer, but it was the truth. It is rare to find studies which establish causal links between curricular change, teacher education, and improvements in standards, because that's such a complex set of relationships. However, many insights into the improvement of practices were identified from a range of settings which may be of value to consider in the Scottish context. So again, we're not offering quick fixes. We're suggesting you need to study what is possible, what is going on elsewhere, and judge whether it is relevant to the Scottish context. Thirdly, exploring the relationships between forms of teacher education, professionalism, and pupil outcomes. Well, one thing we did find through looking at the literature was that you could tease out different conceptions of teacher professionalism in the literature. And I'll say more about that in a moment. And those conceptions imply different approaches to teacher education. The actual search for evidence of linkages between enhanced professionalism and pupil outcomes, there's a lot of contradictory evidence on that, and in the end we had to say it's somewhat inconclusive. These four models that we identified, we called or labelled effective, reflective, enquiring, and transformative. Now, this is a kind of continuum or spectrum, using Eric Hoyle's old term from the 1970s in England, ranging from a fairly restricted view of teacher professionalism through to a more extended and extensive view. The effective teacher is the one who delivers what they're told to deliver, the one who teaches what's in the curriculum and gets students to achieve reasonably well in the testing, the assessment they receive. But it doesn't go beyond that. It's a kind of minimalist view of what it is to be a teacher. It's very much skills and craft based. The reflective teacher is also effective, but is asking himself or herself questions about why they are doing these things. What are the values that are being conveyed by their teaching? The inquiring teacher is the teacher who's beginning to actually investigate their own practice in order to try and improve it. So a kind of research orientation towards teaching. And then the transformative teacher, rarely modelled anywhere in the world other than in a few radical situations, but the transformative teacher who believes not only have they a responsibility to help students learn to find their place in the world, but they do that in order to try and bring about social or cultural or political progress for their learners, for their children, but also for the society at large. So it's a more radical view of what a teacher might be. And I'll come back to this fourfold model in a moment. The final objective was to provide an overview of effective practice in evaluating teacher education. Well, again, we looked at three particular approaches: research-based evaluation, inspection-based evaluation, and self-evaluation. Each of those, we say, has some strengths and weaknesses. They can all provide evidence to help with the development and improvement of teacher education. But the amount of evidence available in relation, especially to inspection and self-evaluation, is actually quite limited at the moment. And so research-oriented evaluation is probably the strongest of the three at present. Now, to turn back to this key question about the relationship between research, policy, and practice, we offered our literature review to Donaldson. He said, "Thank you very much, that's very helpful. It's quite long, it's quite detailed, doesn't give me the answers I was looking for, but it helps to inform my thinking." That's what he said. And his own report was then published, called Teaching Scotland's Future, at the beginning of last year. Reading that report, it was very clear that he drew very directly on a wide range of evidence. Yes, on our literature review, but not only on that. The range of evidence he had gathered included evidence drawn from a range of international visits, as well as submissions made, and the teacher's questionnaire that was available. The report had 50 recommendations. The Scottish Government issued a response a few weeks later saying that they accepted all of the recommendations in whole or in part, and that an implementation group would be set up and charged with drawing up an action plan. That group, now called the National Partnership Group, has been co-chaired by the providers of teacher education, the local authorities, and the government itself, with representation from the General Teaching Council, a body established in the mid-1960s in Scotland and very influential in teacher education, as well as representation from the Curriculum and Inspection Agency, which is now called Education Scotland. This process again demonstrating a commitment to collaborative working in developing policy. I'd like to give now one example of how our literature review appears to have influenced Donaldson's report. This is an extract from Donaldson's report. He refers to the 4 influential paradigms of teacher professionalism that we had coined, had summarized in the report, and goes on to say, in defining teaching as a complex activity, he says, final sentence, this concept of professionalism takes each individual teacher's responsibility beyond the individual classroom, outwards into the school, to teacher education and the profession as a whole. A very holistic, ambitious and demanding view of teaching and teacher education. So, using that as an example, it seems to me that at least in principle, there's a very strong commitment in Scotland to connecting research, policy and practice in the development of teacher education. Now, there are problems in Scotland, the same as everywhere else, but I wanted to emphasize that very explicit commitment, serious attempt to use evidence and to draw policy up on a well-informed basis rather than what we're going to see next. If you look south beyond the wall that Hadrian built, not with his own hands, but he had a lot of people to help him, if you look south to England, things are rather different. In terms of population, the size of population, England is about 9 times the size of Scotland. The land mass is only about twice or 2.5 times that of Scotland, but the population is 9 times larger. And that makes England 3 times the size, roughly, of the population of Chile. Teacher education provision in England is much more diverse than in Scotland, with a large number of universities involved, something like 90 universities, but with many alternative routes of entry into teaching, including employment-based routes, some of which include little or no university-based study, and also the Teach First scheme based on Teach for America that seeks to attract successful graduates who would not otherwise go into teaching. I don't have time here to go into great detail, but it seems to me, having moved back to England recently, and knowing that there has been lots of very good practice in England in teacher education, it seems to me that there are currently 2 major threats to teacher education in England, and actually they're interrelated. The first is the failure, the relative failure in England to join up research and policy and practice in any meaningful way. The second is the ideological drive to take away the intellectual underpinning from teacher education altogether, to treat teaching as a craft rather than as a profession. On the first threat, this is demonstrated, the failure to join up research and policy practice. It's demonstrated by the very selective and partial way in which evidence is used in government policy documents. And I've done a study of one of the major policy documents on teacher education in England and have found it very wanting in terms of academic rigor and indeed of evidence-based reasoning. But that weakness is also demonstrated by the drastic reduction in funding for educational research, including research about teacher education in England, since the current government took office in 2010, albeit at a time of great financial stringency. Educational research tends to have been seen as a luxury that can be done without during a period of financial restraint. In my view, a very erroneous approach. On the second threat, the ideological threat, it's very clear that our current government in England does not value the contribution that universities have made and can make to teacher education. Indeed, it has explicitly said that it wants teacher education to be increasingly led from and by the schools. Here's just one example of a statement by the Secretary of State for Education, one Michael Gove, who I'm sorry to say did his higher education actually in Scotland rather than in England, so I don't know quite where he went wrong, but he says, we will reform initial teacher training so that more training is on the job, and it focuses on key teaching skills, including teaching early reading and mathematics, managing behaviour, and responding to pupils' special educational needs. Now, of course, all of those things are incredibly important, but they do not amount to the whole of what teaching is. They do not represent the complexity of the challenge for early years or primary or secondary teachers. They see teaching as a simple activity rather than as a complex activity, where all that is required is good subject knowledge and authority, the ability to manage children, not children's learning, but to manage children. So I'm not suggesting that these are bad things, what he's emphasizing, simply that they are not enough and they do not get anywhere near to capturing what it is to be a good teacher. In their major reports on teaching, both the OECD and McKinsey, these influential reports that have had impact around the world, both those reports suggest that teacher education heard these names before. Those systems are ones which do value teaching and teacher education very highly, both in terms of pay and conditions for teachers, but also in terms of high entry qualifications into the profession, often at master's level. Why is it that English ministers who praise these countries for their success do not appear to consider that their success may be related to the investment in teaching and teacher education? However, before concluding, I want to redress the balance a bit, because I've been so negative about what's happening in England that I want to just remind myself and make sure you are aware that there's actually a lot of very successful practice and research in England. There have been very many successful school-based teacher education schemes that do have intellectual rigor and do have a research orientation. And amongst those, I'm very happy to report that Oxford, with its well-known internship scheme, has a long track record of such provision, which we intend to maintain and develop. Now, to move towards some conclusions in two parts. And I hope you can see these conclusions are derived from what I've been saying over the last 30 minutes or so. The first part of my conclusions concern teacher education and research. Research in teacher education is very important. That's researching within the practice of teacher education. If we see teaching itself as an inquiry-based profession, then surely teacher education must also be an inquiry-based activity. Indeed, the three presentations this morning in this room were very strong examples of research in teacher education. In a sense, I'm talking about research on practice in teacher education. But this is not enough. We also need research on teacher education. That is still too scarce. We need more research on teacher education. Research that looks from the outside at what is happening in teacher education. It needs to be theoretically informed and should include work that is large-scale and longitudinal and that uses a full range of research methods. Very often that'll be research about policy and may include comparative studies, international surveys. Much of the work that Beatrice has done is a good example of research on teacher education. But I'd add a third dimension to this, which is research about or around teacher education, and that, I think, is even rarer. When Andy Hargreaves was asked a question yesterday about research, part of his answer was to say, don't just be driven by government agendas, but make sure you're thinking more broadly about independent research that really goes beyond current policies and practices. So that would be research that understands or seeks to understand teacher education in a broader context. For example, taking historical or anthropological or political science or social theory perspectives. And the context like this conference, which is emphasizing interdisciplinarity, is surely a good breeding ground for that kind of research. It's work that will be essentially interdisciplinary and will indeed explore the relationship between teacher education and the wider society. It's research aimed at developing theory as well as policy and practice. So that's my first set of conclusions. The second set of conclusions takes me back to the connections between research, policy and practice. Only connect. This phrase, which apparently is a British phrase, joined upness in policy and practice and research. And this implies there is a great need for a growth in the range, the scope and the quality of teacher education research, that there needs to be a sustained attempt to develop policy and practice that is informed by research and other relevant forms of evidence in contrast to ideology. Thirdly, that increasing international dialogue around these matters will enhance and strengthen the future of teacher education. And this may be partial on my part, but I have having been a teacher for nearly 10 years and then worked as a teacher educator and researcher, I do believe we should be working to consolidate the university contribution to teacher education and exploring more productive ways of working in a wider professional community between researchers, practitioners and policymakers. So those are my two sets of conclusions. If we get these matters right, then I think there is the potential to develop a self-sustaining capacity within the teaching profession and teacher education that will ensure the very highest quality of teaching is available to meet the needs of young people of today as they grow into this rapidly changing, globalized society that presents so many major challenges. And that those young people can be inspired with confidence and ambition and a commitment to a just and democratic future. Now, I'm going to finish with two quotations. One is about trusting teachers, and that connects with the whole idea of professional capital that Andy was talking about yesterday. The other talks more broadly about trust in society. So the first is a quotation from Pasi Sahlberg, one of the Finnish education experts who is frequently cited, who reminds us, on the basis of the Finnish experience, a critical condition for attracting the most able young people year after year to teacher education is that a teacher's work should become an independent and respectful profession rather than merely a technical implementation of externally mandated standards, mindless tests, and administrative burdens. That second way, I would suggest, that seems to be coming back with a vengeance in England. But the first part of that quotation, the trusting part, I think is much more redolent of what is the situation in Scotland. So trusting teachers. And Tony Judt, the late European historian, in his book called Ill Fares the Land, suggests the fact remains. He's really reviewing or making a call for a return to social democratic approaches to governance and to society as a response to the impact of neoliberalism across the world. He's saying the fact remains that trust and cooperation were crucial building blocks for the modern state. And the more trust there was, the more successful the state. He goes on to say, thinking about Europe, the kind of society where trust is widespread is likely to be fairly compact and homogeneous. The most developed and successful welfare states of Europe are Finland, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands and Austria, with Germany, formerly West Germany, an interesting outlier. Now, he was just thinking about Europe, and I do wonder to what extent such a view is relevant in South America, Latin America, and in Chile in particular. Indeed, I wonder to what extent the ideas that I've explored this morning, based on my experience in two parts of the United Kingdom, concerning the connectedness or not between policy, practice and research in teacher education, I wonder to what extent they are relevant in the Chilean context. Gracias. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ian, for a very, I think, enthusiastic reminder of the importance of teacher education and teachers. Questions?
Muchas gracias por la presentación, profesor. Yo quisiera hacer dos puentes de su presentación con Chile. Sí, está. Que respecto a qué es lo que salió de esta gran revisión que usted contó para el caso escocés y el caso chileno, hay dos temas que a mí me gustaría saber qué surgió de esta revisión desde el punto de vista de la investigación. Uno tiene que ver con todo lo que son en un contexto que es el contexto de la necesidad de regular mejor lo que es las pedagogías en Chile, la formación para docentes. Ya en Chile tenemos alrededor de 110.000 estudiantes de pedagogía y por lo tanto hay una gran heterogeneidad de instituciones formadoras y hay un debate muy importante respecto de cómo se puede asegurar calidad de toda la formación de profesores. Entonces, uno de los temas que está en boga es el tema de hacer un examen de habilitación profesional. Es decir, que al final de la formación que dan las universidades, ya no sean solo las universidades las que acrediten que ese profesional tiene una calidad suficiente, porque se ha demostrado que eso no ocurre bien, y se ha propuesto la idea de hacer una examinación final, ya que sería como esta provenincia que usted escuchó antes de investigaciones, pero convertido en un examen de habilitación profesional. Yo quisiera saber qué dice la investigación respecto de este tipo de exámenes, qué viabilidad tienen, qué consecuencias tienen, y si efectivamente la investigación muestra virtudes o cómo debiesen ser estos exámenes para que sean lo más virtuosos posibles. Y la segunda consulta tiene que ver con algo más preciso, que es en la formación inicial docente y el peso o la importancia que puede tener y ejercer la formación docente el aprendizaje entre pares. Es decir, que sean los propios pares, otros docentes, quienes se conviertan en referentes de aprendizaje, modelos de acción, en fin, formas de aprendizaje que no sean solo los docentes universitarios, los que, o bien que hayan alguna proporción en las universidades de docentes de aula o de practitioners que también transfieran sus conocimientos. Esas dos consultas.
I'll have a go at answering that first double question. The question about testing students as they finish their teacher education is a common question. Again, the research does not show simple connections between how students perform on their final tests and their long-term career development. But it would be reasonable to say from the research that the elements where students entering teaching are tested or assessed on their practice have a closer connection with their short-term effectiveness in the classroom than the assessment of their academic achievement during their teacher training, if I can make that distinction. It depends also what kinds of tests you're talking about. In the English context, in the about 15 years ago, exit tests were introduced in addition to the final assessment of students by their institutions. So students would be assessed and graded by their institutions as to how well they had performed during the course, but they would also have to sit a nationally set test in numeracy, in literacy, and in ICT. Those tests are in the process of now being brought to the beginning of the teacher education program so that there'll be requirement to pass them before you start your teacher training. So this is a long way of saying I don't think there are easy answers. The other important point to say, I think, is about the quality assurance systems for the provision itself, as well as assessing the individual student teacher. The program, the provision, must be judged against some quality criteria as well. And again, in Scotland and England, there have been slightly different approaches to that, but there are frameworks, structures in place through which providers have to get their provision accredited at a national level. And that's about ensuring quality. And the idea there, of course, is that if students go through an accredited program, they will reach at least a certain threshold of performance that they can then take into the profession. Most providers in England and Scotland, certainly university-based providers, see that threshold as very minimal and aspire to achieve much more through their programs than the standards that are set at national level. Now, the second part of the question about learning between peers, Yes, I'm not sure the research evidence is there to really demonstrate the benefit of that, but the wider professional view is surely that what Andy would call the professional capital is built very significantly through social interaction within the professional community, and that certainly should be there during the pre-service, the initial training, as well as in later stages of career development. And whilst it is necessary to assess each individual for their achievement, that doesn't prevent their learning being much more through collective peer-to-peer processes, and indeed that would seem in professional experience to enhance students' learning and their understanding of what it is to become a teacher. So my short answer is I don't think the research gives us easy answers to those questions, gives us a few insights, but really in the end those two questions are much more about professional judgment based on experience. We should perhaps devise research studies to investigate both of those questions.
Gracias. La pregunta va a lo siguiente. Usted dio bastante énfasis en lo que es un profesor transformador. La pregunta es, en la investigación que se hizo sobre este tema, ¿se puede diagnosticar que eso es algo intrínseco que viene en la formación personal de los atributos del profesor? ¿O esto puede ser algo que puede ser formativo a través de las enseñanzas? Y si esto fuese así, ¿cuáles serían los currículum o las implementaciones para implementarlo en el currículo de educación superior? Esa es mi pregunta.
Where was that from? Just here? Yeah. Thank you. I couldn't see where you were. It's a very interesting question. Can a transformative approach to teaching be developed through training, or is it more to do with a matter of the individual personality? I think it probably the real answer is that it's to do with both. But if you are defining teaching and entry into teaching is seeking to attract people who can work for example, improved social justice, improved democracy, both in their classrooms and beyond, then I think through carefully planned training experiences, you can help student teachers to understand the influence they might have, not only on their learners, but beyond. And I think it is important that students get the opportunity to study the impact of teaching on young people's lives, good teaching, less good teaching. There are examples. I mean, the classic example, I guess, was actually from community adult education in Brazil, wasn't it, with Paulo Freire as the ultimate transformative teacher whose work in adult and community literacy led to very real political change. Now, that wasn't prescribed by government standards of any sort at all, but even where teacher education is prescribed by governments, if there's a commitment, as there is certainly in the Scottish standards, to social justice and democracy, then it seems reasonable to expect a teacher education program to help student teachers understand how they can have a positive impact on their students and on the lives of their students outside of the school. I think, yes, we know that some people are more inclined in that way than others, but I think it is actually a duty, a responsibility to try to bring about progressive change through our work as teacher educators. So I think we may meet some resistance to that, but we should face that and work with it to support students become teachers who can change students' lives.
La última pregunta.
Hola, mi nombre es Verónica, soy profesora de Educación Física y quería hacer una pregunta muy puntual. ¿En qué medida en los planes, en la formación inicial y continua de los profesores, tanto de Inglaterra como de Escocia, están presentes temáticas como la atención a la diversidad, la multiculturalidad, la interculturalidad, etcétera, temas como escuela exclusiva, incluso temas como de justicia social que usted acaba de mencionar. Eso, gracias.
It's again a good question. There was a movement during the 1970s and 1980s to try and improve teacher education so that it reflected more authentically the diverse nature of Scottish and English, respectively, society, the diversity within society. And indeed, there was also a move to ensure that teachers had a more outward-looking perspective in general, so that they became more aware of the European context and of the global context in which they were working. In the drive to impose standards on teacher education, particularly in England, those wider conceptions of what teaching is have tended to be suppressed, withdrawn, so that the increasing emphasis on classroom teaching skills, what I call the craft-based approach, has tended to lead to a reduction in things like intercultural education. Personally, I don't think it's any less important than it was in the 1970s and 80s. In fact, it's probably more important than ever. And I think one of the challenges for teacher educators who aspire to transformative models is to try and find ways of bringing those wider dimensions of teacher education back into the curriculum, especially where they're not encouraged to do so by national frameworks.
Many thanks. Muchas gracias, Professor Menter, por una excelente